I would like you to think about which one of these responses or which type of response are your students most likely to produce. So you have the prompt here. Now we're going to look at three different responses for it. Here's the response for CLB 7. Have a look at the response here. This response for CLB 7, it's definitely on task. It does address the task. It is polite, which is a requirement of the prompt. Both the conditions that were mentioned in the original prompt have been addressed here. So the speaker, the student, has addressed the prompt in its totality. However, some things are missing from this answer. The response reads a bit basic at this point. The lead-in or the introduction, the opener is not very warm. Before they get to the conditions, there's not a lot of positive framing before it. So social convention might demand that before we talk about a restriction or a condition, we might want to frame that with a bit more of a positive sentence or lead into that a bit more warmly. But we don't see that here in this answer. The closing is also not very natural because we're looking at a conversation between a friend with another friend. So the response at the end says, "Call me back, thanks." So the task is complete, but the social awareness is not very high in this response. Let's take a look at the response for CLB 8 now. Here it starts with, "Hey Derek, hope you're well." So just that little bit of information, or just that little bit of an extension to the opener has made it a bit warmer, and it sounds more natural, like we are talking to a friend. Now here, before we get to the condition, there is a bit of positive framing before it. So something like, "Oh, my health club has given me a free guest pass, and I thought of you straight away." And also we see things like, "Just so you know." These are things that show us that there is a higher level of social awareness in this response. Some of the conditions, while they're being mentioned, have been softened. So when we're talking to a friend, and if we're talking to them about something that might be a restriction or a condition in this situation, softening the sentence makes it more socially appropriate. The sales element in particular here has been softened. So Bina in the chat has mentioned, is warmer being more informal? Not necessarily. It depends on who we're talking to. Here we are talking to a friend. So it can definitely be more natural rather than being more informal. But that will always depend on who we are talking to. So both the conditions are covered here, and they are covered quite naturally. So this response gets a CLB 8. Let's now look at the next response, which is CLB 9. Once again, there are things you might be able to notice right away. Have a look at the opening. Once we've said the greeting, the speaker goes on to say, "My health club has given me a free guest pass, so I wondered if you'd like to come with me next time I go." And things like, "I think you'll love the club." These are things that are more socially aware in terms of talking to a friend. Both the conditions have more positive framing here. So when they talk about restrictions, they have framed it a bit more positively. So using things like, "and another thing you need to know." That makes it more natural. The rhythm of the answer is more natural. The phrasing is more natural. So once again, the task is complete. The rhythm is more natural. It's got more of a positive framing. That gets it a CLB 9. Now, my question was, which of these three responses do your students most often produce or are more likely to produce? And what does that tell you about their current CLB level? Right, there's still a lot of responses, everyone. Thank you. A lot of sevens. Many of you have chosen CLB 7 or 8. Definitely not 9 here. So 7 and 8 is where your students might be falling at this point. Mostly 7, 8 is rare. Alright, excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that, everyone. What that tells us, and what that tells you more importantly, is that the answer, while it might be correct, the response might be correct, it might also, cover the prompt in completion. But if it's not completely socially aware, or if it doesn't sound as natural as it could be, the points will be stuck at a certain level. So now, what you can do is you can effectively name this problem that your students might be having. This is the only speaking task. Respond to a situation is the only speaking task that scores for register, because the big trait here is appropriacy rather than content. So the differentiator is bigger here across the CLB level. For CLB 7, 8 and 9, we saw these markers last time. At a CLB 7, the student might be considered adequate intermediate, at a CLB 8 fluent intermediate, and at 9 initial advanced. So what that tells you about their response, if most of your students fall in the CLB 7 category at this point, that means that their register is appropriate, so it's not incorrect, but it can sound a bit formulaic, it can sound a bit memorized, or it can sound a bit generic. It does state the content clearly, but the warmth might be missing. The natural element of the answer might be lacking. And it doesn't close or wrap up as naturally as a real conversation would. So it wraps up kind of abruptly or unnaturally. So what you should be teaching for, if your students are largely falling in this category, what you're going to teach for is to read for the relationship first. Try to identify what's the relationship between the speaker and the listener, and also work on adding more of a positive frame before they get to any of the main points. So, for example, in this prompt, we were talking about some conditions or restrictions that they would have to follow at the gym. But if they frame it more positively, that makes their answer more natural and warmer. At a CLB 8, a lot of you mentioned that your students might be able to get to that point as well, which is fantastic. That means that they are definitely more aware of the context, and they have more layers and more nuance in their answer. There is definitely some positive framing that is happening in their responses, and the tone is definitely managed correctly. So what you're going to teach at this point to bring them up to the next level is to teach for variety in terms of openers and closings, so that the students are not always using the same type of opener and closing sentence. They have more range to draw from. And at 9, it definitely means then that the sophisticated register is consistent throughout the response, the phrasing is natural, and the reader is throughout the answer aware of what they're doing, and they're also aware of where to soften their sentences so that it doesn't come across as too direct or rude in some cases. So what you teach here is how to elaborate on these ideas, how to soften before they say what they're going to say. So from CLB 7 to 8, the jump requires, just from being on task, it requires them to be more socially aware. and the jump from CLB 8 to 9 requires them to go from layered and nuanced to almost native, near native, where they are aware of every sentence and step. Now it's your turn, everyone. Read the response and read the prompt on the screen here. I would like you to tell me in the chat which CLB level is this and what are your two strongest clues for deciding this answer. I'm going to give you a moment for this. Right, everyone. I see a lot of responses well done. Quite a few of you have chosen 7. Lots of you have also chosen 8. I see a few 9s as well. I'd also like you to tell me what are your clues for choosing these. Right, so it's not fully near native, someone had mentioned. So it's not a 9. Ramanjit has mentioned that the greeting and the ending is not quite formal or polite, so it's at a 7. Manju has mentioned that knowledge of local area and working with groups. Okay, so that's your clue here. Alright, now I see quite a few of your reasons as well for choosing these. No register or appropriate clothing. Didn't address the person directly. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for sharing your responses, everyone. Let's take a look. This response for this prompt is in the B2 category, solidly CLB 7 or 8. The task is complete, as you can see. So all the elements were addressed. The recommendation was made, which was the main point of the prompt. So they've been able to complete the task. The register is also appropriate. The vocabulary is connected to the topic, so it's functional. However, there's not a lot of exploration of the vocabulary in depth. The speaker mentions that Sarah is very patient, but does not support that with an example of anything specific. So what that does is that it stays a bit superficial. They've mentioned that this person's patient, but we don't really see any examples of that, or we don't see anything that could actually highlight that quality. There are linking devices that are used for coherence here. However, the linking devices in this response are largely additive. So the linking devices are words like and also. These are all linking devices that serve to add another point. But linking devices go beyond that as well. So they do add ideas, but linking devices can do other functions as well, can serve other functions as well. We see a bit of that's lacking here. If this answer were to be a CLB 9 answer, it would require a bit more in terms of the vocabulary being deeper, a more concrete example of Sarah's impact, and it would show more variety in the cohesive devices that were used. So as you can see here on this table, it shows you what you see in the prompt, in the response to the prompt, and what it tells you about the students who answer. We're doing this today to have a better understanding of the minor differences that keep a student at CLB 7 or 8 and what they might require from you to push them into the next score bracket. Let's move on and take a look at the common topic areas for this question type. For respond to a situation, your students will commonly see topics in these 5 clusters. Topics could be either social or personal. They could be workplace related and professional. They might be educational. They might be related to being a consumer or serving somebody in terms of consumer goods and services. And finally, they might be related to giving recommendations to someone or asking for recommendations to someone. What's important for you now is to teach across all of these topic clusters. A common error might be that students are only preparing for one type of topic. So if they're only thinking in an educational context, or if they're only practicing in a workplace context, it might not prepare them appropriately to respond naturally in other situations, because the way we might respond at work is different from how we would respond in a social situation. And similarly, it's different from how we would respond with someone we don't know in a consumer or service situation. So if students are only practicing for one type of context, that means that the vocabulary and phrases that they are working with are limited. Also, take a look at the student tip at the bottom. The answers for this question should be up to 40 seconds. So it's very important that the task is complete, so their point must be stated clearly. Then they should be giving a reason to support it or add some detail to it, and then close naturally. You will see that the word naturally keeps coming back when we talk about this question type. This is because that's important for social awareness, and since appropriacy is a major criteria or a major trait for this question type, that's definitely one of the things to focus on. Right, we're going to do a quick activity now, everyone. I'm going to all of those related to the question type that we're talking about. Type the number in the chat for any one of these prompts. Pick any one of the prompts. And I would like you to tell me what's your choice of register for this. For this prompt, what's the register that you would use or suggest, and a reason for it. These prompts to focus on the relationship. Number one talks about talking to a friend, so an informal tone would be more natural. That's more appropriate here. If you're talking to someone in prompt 5 who's a new person who's joined your company, you've chosen a semi-formal tone, which is not too formal, but it's not too informal because you don't know them, but you might be working with them. So absolutely correct. Thank you for choosing these. I'd also like to tell you at this point that these types of questions and the samples that we are looking at here, these are all available in the PTE Core question bank, which you will get access to if you join 3 or 4 sessions in this series of webinars.